You are entering the Nillyverse with your hosts Gustavo and Rodney Perry. This episode has been brought to you by the Society of Namecoin. No.
Well, good morning, Gustavo.
Good morning, Rodney.
How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Good. So today, this is an interesting day. We're going to be talking about a section of the book called Confluence of Writings on Nothing. And it's fairly long and complex. And I would just ask people who are maybe listening that this would be a good section to read. We look at 9 different traditions of world religions and bringing in all these notions of the confluence of thought on nothing. It's not hard to read, but it's a little bit difficult to present in a kind of quick way. So anyway, I would suggest that. So we're going to look at how thought about nothing, about how to know nothing, flows together, both from science and religion, religions from around the world, West and East and science. So we call it the confluence, the flowing together. And I was just thinking, I really love the word confluence. And I remember when I first ran into it, is when I was studying Indian religion. In India, it's called Sangam, flowing together, exact same word, flowing together. And there's a famous place in North India where 3 sacred rivers all come together, the Saraswati, the Ganges, and the Yamuna. One of the favorite bathing sites for people in India. And every 12 years, they do this famous, what they call the pot celebration, the Kumbh Mela. And it's the pot that the gods were making. So millions of people come. It's a famous thing. Every 12 years, millions of people come from all over the world. So anyway, the word confluence has a kind of an important feeling to me. And that's one of the reasons I like to use it for this, because we're talking about an important notion that we can find places where religions and science meet. And that's what we call the confluence. Let's just quickly do a little something to remind people of where we are. We have talked about the heuristic value of what we call the rarefying principle. And we see that in the history of science, the rarefying principle has been very central to how the nature of matter has been understood. Just to sort of remind people, when we talk about the history of what the atom was thought to be, we go all the way back to 1900, and we talked about this before with Thomson, and he has this great name of corpuscles floating around in a kind of gelatinous ooze. That was his notion of what an atom was about. And then in 1910, Rutherford came around, and he basically changed from a kind of romantic name, corpuscle, heavy name, to the word electron. And he's saying the electrons don't float in anything. They float in empty space. And then in the 60s, we started to find out that, in fact, the nucleus wasn't an elementary particle, but it was made up of other particles. And as we got smaller and smaller into those particles, they started to call them quarks. Quarks have all these odd names, like for colors and waves and things that I really liked. And then as we got into the 70s, it got even more rare, and scientists started to suggest that the quarks themselves were actually not 3-dimensional particles, but 1-dimensional rhythms called strings. The nature of the atom had started out as a corpuscle floating in an ooze, and it got rarer and rarer and rarer, reducing matter, getting rid of matter, wiping away matter, until we get to the point where we're saying that the essence of an atom is, in fact, a vibration. About as rare as you can possibly get. So it's an interesting principle, and it's helped us with a lot of our understanding.
Yeah, just a point of clarification, the difference between the word mass and matter, the scientific theories speak of, the models they speak of, are shedding matter, and that is correct and summarized by the rarefying principle. The mass is still there. It's just dispersed in a tighter and tighter space, essentially. So it's focused on tighter and tighter space. So on the whole, like if there were some sort of absolute sense of space, then the matter in that space becomes rarer and rarer. The mass is still the same because we're just focusing the matter into a tighter and tighter space.
Thanks. You understand those things a lot better than I do.
It's just terminology, that's all.
No, they're good. That's good. The kind of narrative point that this has is that this rarefying principle that has helped science in understanding the nature of matter has also been very helpful in us looking at how religions talk about the nature of the human being and the nature of the divine. In fact, the rarefying principle is really central to the understanding of how the human being and God are related, the divine are related. So, as we turn to religions, we will hear, as we're looking at various religious traditions, that the essence of the human being is stripped as we start looking at and analyzing it more and more and more. And steadily and systematically, human beings are not the body, they're not the things that human beings own, they're not the thoughts, they're not our aspirations, and so forth. Even in the East, oftentimes, and in the mystical traditions of the West, even our individuality and our selfhood is stripped away from us.
Right.
When we start looking for our essence. So that rarefying principle is also applied to the nature of the divine and analyzing what the real essence of God is. And you'll find that God is stripped of a body, then God is stripped of its voice, and then there's no personality, and then there's no form, and in fact, sometimes not even any being. So
and I'll even go one further, sometimes not even a name.
Not even a name, yeah, absolutely. Naming it is somehow an affront to the essence of the divine, which cannot be named.
You might have, to our listeners, might have picked up a book where you see in reference to God, the word string, G_D, because you can't even name God. It's an affront.
That's a very Jewish people, that's a very familiar way of talking, because they talk about the 4 letters in what we call Jehovah. And as it actually appears in the Bible, are just 4 consonants with no vowels. And that leaves for a wide open interpretation of how actually that should be said.
Unspeakable. Without vowels, it's like as if it's unspeakable, right? Like you can't, how do you pronounce that, right?
Yeah. I had a professor in graduate school who used to call it Yehovah.
Yehovah.
Back to the notion of confluence. So what we see in the various religious traditions, and I should just mention again that we look closely at the teachings of various religious traditions around the world, because we've seen that it is the pattern of understanding about the nature of the world that comes from religion, philosophy, and science that is the deepest and most helpful understanding. So we're looking at religion at the moment. So within religion, the essence of what we're trying to say here is that within these traditions, applying the rarefying principle to the human being and to the nature of the divine at its most rare and at its most real, because those go together, the human being and the divine are the same. They are nothing. That's why the word confluence, I think, is important. We're not just talking about stories, but we're talking about a confluence of the nature of a human being and God. So let me just do one example. Within the book, I say we should look at it because in the book we do like 9 traditions. I go deeply into 9 different traditions around the world, both East and West, just to show how central this notion is. But let's just look at one. So let's look at the 13th century Christian mystical sort of fellow, Meister Eckhart. There's this famous sermon he gave called Sanctification. So in Sanctification, Eckhart gives us a kind of a notion of how the nature of God and man can be, the nature of God and human being can arise as being the same. So he says one thing. He's saying, in order for this to occur, this process of sanctification, he says that the spirit must remain immovable. And by spirit, he would probably, in a more common language that we'd use today, we would probably talk about consciousness or soul, a kind of a combination of souls. So we have a quiet mind and a quiet spirit. And Eckhart is saying that that spirit must become absolutely rock-like and immovable. And so it's not, we aren't thinking about the things that we love or that we hate or the joys of our life or the sorrows of our life. And as he says, the image is that our spirit must become like a mountain that cannot be moved by a gentle breeze. The gentle breeze would be the normal things that we're thinking about and concerned about in our lives that normally have us kind of buffeted about and so forth, that within this sanctification process, the spirit becomes immovable. And those aspects of life are like a gentle breeze against a mountain. You remain absolutely stable. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about Eckhart in the stability of the spirit, it is an exact echo of Taoist teachings from China, exact echo of it. And this famous Zhuangzi from China, he says, the still mind of the sage is the mirror of heaven and earth. All things are not able to disturb the mind. They couldn't speak Chinese or Eckhart must have been speaking German. They couldn't speak to each other, but they were saying the same thing. So Eckhart continues. He says, he gives this image of a tablet. He's saying, if you want to write on a tablet, it has to be erased. It has to be completely white. It has to be blank. And so the notion there is that the human being utterly rarefies itself. The human being utterly rarefies itself. It means it's completely quiet, completely still. And in that blank state, God can enter. It's another image. It's like rock solid, God emptying an empty vessel. And so God can only write on a tablet that's blank. So anyway, this echoes a lot of different writings, St. John of the Cross and a variety of other people. And we talked about this kenosis. So when the self is emptied, that's kenosis. When the self is emptied, then God can enter and so forth. So then he finishes up his sermon. He talks about this rock-like, what we call psyche or self. And he says that when the self absolutely loses all distinctiveness, then the light of God can enter into it. Again, another notion of this is not a blank slate, but once one is dark, then the light of God can enter. Very interesting stuff. Eckhart, in another sermon, it's very similar, but in another sermon, he says he's left us with his sort of famous phrases. And he's saying that when the soul is empty and clear, then person goes from its das ist, that means the is, from what is, into das nicht, into the not. So when the person is empty, when the spirit is quiet, you go from is to is not. You go into nothing. So all these voices that we've seen, especially throughout this is a Christian tradition, this is their version of the rarefying principle. And the best way to become aware of in God's nature is to join God's nature. When one has that sort of empty quality, one goes from saying the das ist, that means that which is, to the das nicht, meaning that which is not. So the human becomes nothing and greets God as nothing. That's a kind of a Christian language for this, what I call the rarefying principle. That's just one example. Within this section, we look at 9 different traditions from around the world and we get a sense that this rarefying principle is active within all the traditions of religion throughout the world. And we look at early Buddhism, we look at Zen, we look at Taoism in the East, and a couple forms of Hinduism. And in the West, we look at Christianity, we look at Judaism. And there's one of them, it's my favorite, from Islam. And they talk about this language of al-fana, which I really liked, and translates as something like dying before you die. And so their image was not that you empty and become quiet, but in fact you die. Yeah. And in that dying, you can greet God. Al-fana, I like that one as well. In that emptying of the self through various images of how that emptying occurs, you see that there's a unity of the human being and nothing. Very interesting stuff.
Let me sort of pull on that a little bit, you speak of going from is to is not, and right. The rarefying that happens in that process. I'd say let's sort of examine the verb to be and distinguish between the copulative function, saying in the sense X is Y, the copulative function of to be, the verb to be, versus the existence mediating function, which is just that X is.
X is.
So the verb to be in Western culture means has both the copulative function, X is predicate. Y, and the existence mediating function, just that X is. And perhaps the reason why it's easier for Buddhist or for Buddhism to take root in China, or this rarefying acceptance, this rarefying principle acceptance, at least as it relates to the individual and the soul, and why it's maybe more easy to take root in a place like China as opposed to the West, or at least as far back as the 20th century, is that the language doesn't conflate these two parts of being. Oh. The Chinese have a separate sort of word for the copulative to be and the existence mediating to be. So the language is already primed to avoid this kind of a confusion.
Huh. I didn't know that. That's great.
So it's possible to conceive of a reality that is both relative to being and other than being by separating those two functions of the verb to be.
That's a really nice image.
So nothing, right, in this case, doesn't mean the absence or negation of reality. It means, or not is, the negation of an existing reality. It means the absence of being. But since the essence of being is contingent, I can either be or not be, and that's essentially what being is. It's a contingent property. Reality by reason alone is essentially that which is not contingent, but necessary. So reality is kind of like above being. Reality is what is necessary and not contingent. Everything that is in the existence mediating function, so that kind of being, that's contingent, but not necessary, as reality is necessary. I guess by this logic, right, if we were to sort of sum all of these ideas up, we could say that God is not the ultimate reality, but reality in relation to which other reality is real. So in this worldview, right, reality is more than being. It's kind of like the arena of being, the arena whereby all these contingent, everything that is contingent can be. So we'll have to sort of maybe break that down a little bit further, like in another episode. But the key point is separating both functions of being, verb to be, from a copulative to be, X is Y, versus just that X is, or the existence mediating.
There is a parallel there when we talk about, like, for instance, various forms of Hindu, where we talk about the manifest and the unmanifest. There's manifest reality, there's unmanifest reality, but then there is the divine. It's not just unmanifest, but the divine is needed for that manifestation to occur, but it's not within it. I never heard it linguistically like that before, so that was cool.
All right, so should we hop on Pop?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, this week I think we have Brian Greene on the podium, and he's talking about something that scientists generally don't speak of. In fact, the clip is from, I think, an entire conference on, or at least a day of a conference, where you had various popularizers of science talking about the storytelling of science, or storytelling in science.
That's right, the function of storytelling.
Yeah, and how important it is to kind of convey the meaning, or at least the interpreted meaning behind whatever it is that a scientist is doing, to the laity, which is what the primary function of a popularizer science is there. It's not to speak to other scientists, because they have their own language for that, i.e. mathematics. They're there to speak in a language that regular people can understand what's going on, or at least a piece of what's going on in science. So with that,
let me point out just one thing about it was a 2-day conference, I think. But if you look at all of them, and I think there are 6-7 people, all famous, world-renowned people, every one of them uses a child as an example for how their language came to be about science. Yeah. And that was interesting, because if you look at the parallel, that means that us, we are the children that the scientists are trying to convey their stories to, and immediately what they thought of. I think Brian Greene talks about his daughter, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's right. His daughter and his son.
Daughter and his son, but others as well. Tyson, I don't remember what Dawkins did. Not very childlike, but
no.
I thought that was pretty interesting. Is that when they started saying children, I said, "Oh, he's talking about me." Anyway,
I'm sure if you press them to, yes, they do see it as children, right? Maybe that's not such a bad thing, as we will soon see. Might be a bit condescending, but
I laughed. It didn't bother me. I kind of laughed. It allowed for the creativity of children. So
yes. All right, here we go.
To get things going. So, my son, he's somewhere out here. He's 8 years old, somewhere out there. There he is, right there. Yeah, good. Thank you. So, when he was about 4.5 years old, I was telling him a lot of bedtime stories, and I was really trying to put some science into the stories, right? So I'd have all these spaceships flying through the universe, but I was always very diligent saying they weren't going faster than the speed of light. One night, my son turns back to me and says, "Dad, speed of light? What about the speed of dark?" And it's like a thought I hadn't really had before. But you see, a young mind grappling with these kinds of ideas takes it to an unusual place. And just to be an equal opportunity parent. My daughter's also out there, And yeah, good. Thank you, Sophia. Good, good, good. And, you know, I have for the last few years been thinking about ideas that are unfamiliar to most people, the possibility of other universes, the multiverse. I mean, you know, most of us were raised to think universe means everything to begin with. There happen to be other universes. And I say most of us with some forethought because, you know, my kids have heard me talk about this stuff all the time since they were little. And Sophia, when she was 3.5, I was holding her one day. I said, Sophia, I love you more than anything in the universe. She turned back to me and said, Dad, universe, multiverse. Now that's how we begin, right? We have these open minds trying to understand everything in the world around us. But as we get older, right, we begin to deal with uncertainty. Like what Feynman was saying, how do you deal with a universe that you don't really understand? How do you deal with cutting edge ideas that you don't even know if they're right or wrong because they're at the forefront and we haven't been able to test them yet? And I got a taste of how different people deal with that when I wrote The Elegant Universe back in 1999. It came out, you know, it appeared on Amazon, and as you all know, you know, Amazon is this wonderfully democratic approach where anybody can write a review of a book that they've read or haven't read. So a few days after the book appeared, you know, somebody wrote in and gave it 5 stars. I was happy that was good. And then I read the review and they said they were so happy that someone finally had written a book on string theory that was accessible because they said it's so hard to criticize things you don't understand. And they went on to say that after reading the book, they felt string theory was a bunch of mathematical buffoons chasing their own tails, and finished by saying that the reviewer felt that the author, namely me, seemed to be about as happy as a pig in shit. And what the reviewer is trying to say is, when you don't know if ideas are right or wrong, as it is with some of these cutting ideas about string theory and other things, there can be a deep level of uncertainty. And how do you deal with it? Feynman found it invigorating. Others find it deeply uncomfortable. And that is a wonderful divide in terms of how one goes about exploring the universe.
That was good.
Yeah, I mean, he's a great storyteller. So yeah, I mean, he talks about, he mentions Feynman. So just previous to Brian Greene speaking, it was Lawrence Krauss, and Lawrence Krauss ends his segment with a video of Feynman concluding everything that, you know, he has to say about science and how he's kind of come to a point in life where he feels like he doesn't have to know everything, and he doesn't have to fear not knowing. And that's perfectly acceptable. And then Brian Greene kind of goes at and says that science is about exploring the world to find answers. Exploration with wonder and kind of childlike. Brings up his daughter and loving the child more than anything else in the multiverse and not the universe, which is kind of cute, right? That the child is kind of paying attention to everything else that Brian Greene brings back home and maybe around the kitchen table or so. She's retaining knowledge of the reality that dad sees or experiences. You know, maybe the more interesting story is the one where he shares about his son, right? That nothing exceeds the speed of light. But what about the speed of dark is what the son sort of shares, which Brian Greene says, well, that could be thought-provoking. Of course, he can quickly sort of stay with the thought for maybe about 2 or 3 seconds before he says, well, dark is just the absence of light. And so there isn't something there to have velocity. But what he could be left with is that it doesn't necessarily make the question meaningless about what about the speed of dark. Yeah, yes, scientifically, maybe it's not appropriate to ascribe a velocity to dark, but it's doesn't make the question meaningless.
That's right.
The child identifying dark as something might indicate naivete, but it can spark investigation into maybe dark matter.
That's right.
Perhaps.
Exactly.
It could get the wheels in Brian Greene's mind going about like sort of dark matter, because we don't see it in the same way that we see sort of regular matter, right? And so maybe the child's comment or question, the child's mind is open. The children are freer to ask ridiculous questions, but maybe if we listen what the free mind has to say, it could sort of provide breakthrough that we need to kind of get past problems that we're experiencing by being so stuck with these boundaries about like, oh, well, light is the only thing that travels velocity because it's the only thing that light is the thing, dark is the absence of a thing, right? And so you could immediately just avoid going further along in that line of questioning. And then sort of Brian Greene talks about how question is, how does the scientist deal with uncertainty? How do you explore the universe? Is it with an invigorated spirit or an uncomfortable spirit? Are you excited at the possibility of discovery, or like uncomfortable in that uncomfortable by, like, say, for instance, the amendments that would need to be made in light of these unexpected discoveries? Where all that you secretly want is certainty and objective agreement with your peers. You want those bound by those laws of physics, like their motion, as being absolute, because that's certain, and I don't have to question that, and I don't need to. Once I know everything in that box, then that's it. Like, I've got it all in my head, and I can consider myself my job done. That sounds like a person that's a little bit uncomfortable at the idea of there being a beyond.
Yeah, we talked somewhere within our book. I forget sometimes what all we wrote about, but we wrote about a scientist, one of the famous ones. I can't remember, was Popper maybe or something, who said that were we to have the eyes of children, we would solve all these problems. But as we get older, we lose the ability to see and to see openly. And so I thought that was an interesting parallel there. That he sort of accepted the eyes of his kids as a way of, and he didn't just say that they were being silly.
Last week we were. This is just a sort of complete tangent, but I think that in the book we didn't share it with viewers about merisms, right?
Oh yeah, merisms, yes,
and all kinds of merisms that there are suggest everything, like heaven and earth. Like, do you have some other examples that you have off the top of your head?
No.
I can't remember. There are a bunch of them, right? To sort of suggest that, but like, I was thinking that the thought came up, like, well, nothingness is our merism. It's basically all that, instead of all that there is, like heaven and earth, the merism is all that is not.
All that is not. Nothing and nothing is our kind of merism. Yeah. There's an interesting aspect that I liked as I was watching these different scientists talk about their relationship to unknowing or uncertainty, is that what are they taking for granted? Where are they in the realm of understanding? Do they take for granted? So I would say Brian Greene is taking for granted that we are uncertain about certain areas there's some particular areas at the fringe or at the circumference of what we know. Mm-hmm. But next year or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, that circumference is going to expand, and we're going to come to a new limit of understanding. But what he takes for granted is that his form of understanding exists outside the circumference of the balloon.
Yes.
That is a scientist's belief. They have an experience of uncertainty being positive, but they interpret that experience to mean, oh, we're going to know more about that when we get the bigger collider. A different way of interpreting that invigoration of the unknown is to say that nothing is attractive. That's another form. Not that you could say that we're at the circumference of understanding, and beyond the circumference of understanding is a new kind of understanding, not expanded scientific understanding, but a greeting of nothing.
That's a great.
It depends. You have different a priori of what it means to be invigorated by nothing. The invigoration, I think, is shared by everybody, but then you interpret it. The scientist interprets it to say, well, we'll expand our realm of scientific knowledge in the next years, whereas someone who has a notion that, let's say, the heuristic of faith that Allport talks about, that going into that realm of the unknown may be not just expanding the same kind of knowledge, but coming into a radically new way of understanding, and that's nihilative knowing. So that's where we're going in the book. I
think you alluded to this. You just said that, about the pull, like, because right now the scientist feels that they push into a new, larger universe. They push the bounds of, or that circumference of knowledge.
They push it.
They push it and don't entertain the possibility that maybe they're being pulled into the nothing, into the new world.
It's an interesting, I've never thought of it quite so clearly, but between us, we just came up with a very good notion.
I think that's really good. Just we need to sort of maybe elaborate further.
Yeah.
There's so many of these little strings that we're leaving behind. I'm feeling like, oh, we need to go back to the writing sort of table and maybe sort of start, maybe for a second edition, right? Like add a couple of chapters to what we've already put down.
That's always possible. We could do a second podcast series where we just start the book over again.
Yeah. I just had a funny thought about we speak about cones, and imagine playing a Jeopardy of cones. Have you ever thought about that? Like, has the dog Buddha nature? And the response by the monk might be moo, which is, I think, nothing.
This means not.
Not.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's the only right answer that you can possibly give to not get hit on the head by your master, right? So, but imagine, one better. So remember, we're playing Jeopardy here, and you need to answer in the form of a question. So what is moo?
What is moo?
What is nothing? What is not? That could actually be a better way of responding to the master's question, right?
That's great. Alex Trebek.
Exactly, yeah. That's all I got.
Okay. That was a good one. Thank you.
Excellent.
That was fun.
That was fun, and I think enlightening. We have a couple of nuggets there that we might want to sort of go back and maybe reflect a little bit more on. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Rodney.
Okay, see you next week.
See ya. Bye.
Entering the Universe has been brought to you by the Society of Namecoin. Until next time. No.